If you remember, a couple of months ago I made a video about the strongest sequences in Wuthering Waves, but ever since then, a lot of new characters have come out and a lot of people have been asking me about my opinions of modern character sequences, so that's what I'm going to be talking about in today's video. So the sequences I'm going to be talking about in today's video are all going to be good investments for the characters in question, and they're going to be sorted into 3 categories. There's either Futuremaxxing, which is sequences that are strong on paper, but they're not currently amazing investments. Then there is the good sequences that are all going to be very strong investments for their respective teams. And then there's the insanely powerful sequences that are just a cut above the rest. Starting with the Futuremaxxing sequences, where there are only 2 characters in this category, being Phoebe and Chisa. Starting with Chisa, I think that her S2 is already proving itself to be a good sequence. It is just straight up stronger than a Shorekeeper S2, but the issue is that Chisa is a lot more limited in her team selection. So currently, the only real team that Chisa has is Thundah, and when you get her S2, you can also use her with Zani, but the same goes for Shorekeeper S2, making Shorekeeper a much stronger option. So currently, it's not like Chisa S2 is an amazing investment, unless you already like the negative status cast. If you want to make your Thundah as strong as possible, getting an S2 Chisa is going to be a very good way to achieve that, but I'm not gonna act like Chisa's S2 is going to be incredibly valuable in the future because we just don't know what the future has in store for characters. And then moving on to Phoebe, Phoebe's S2 is also already a good investment right now. In fact, it's nearly the same as getting Zani's own S1 and S2 for her main DPS team, and obviously it also gives you the benefit of upgrading a DPS Phoebe. So while it is true that S2 Phoebe is a good investment, it's just not as strong as getting Zani's own S1 and S2, and Phoebe as a main DPS is not by any means a top tier, so that's why her sequences are lower value. But the reason I'm putting her in Futuremaxxing is because unlike Zani's S1 and S2, Phoebe's S2 is actually going to help you if there's ever a future Spectrofrazzle based DPS. But much like Chisa, this is something that we just can't really bet on. The reason it's in the same tier as Chisa, however, is because Chisa's S2 getting more use cases is a lot more likely than Phoebe's S2. But to compensate, Phoebe's S2 is more powerful than Chisa's S2. So that's why I decided to rate them in a similar position, although I do think that Chisa's is a better investment than Phoebe's, but again, they're both very dependent on the future. Then next up is the good but not insane tier. There's going to be a lot more in this tier, and it's primarily going to focus on the sequences of main DPS characters. Getting sequences on your main DPS is almost always going to be the best way to invest into your team, but investing into a DPS is rather limiting because when you stop using that DPS, you kind of stop getting the relevance out of that. So let's mention all the DPS characters first, and then I'll talk about the non-DPSs. So Thundah's S2, Zani's S1 and S2, Carlotta's S2, Galbrenna's S2, and Furlova's S2 are all the DPS sequences I have in this tier. They're all going to be very similar DPS increases, being around the 40% ballpark at the S2. This is, at this point, the average for a main DPS's damage increase when you're going from S0 to S2, and as you can imagine, that is going to be very nice, especially in teams where your main DPS is the primary source of damage. In a team like Galbrenna Choyuan, where almost all of the damage is coming from Galbrenna, the 40% damage increase is going to be a lot more relevant than in a Galbrenna Monofusion team, where she's also getting help from both Lupa and Brandt. But no matter what the team is, getting a DPS sequence is almost always going to be the best bet, unless you're an early game DPS like GN. Thundah has one of the strongest sequence lineups in the entire game. But one of the reasons that I don't really have her in the highest tier is because within Whimpering Wastes, she is not by any means a top tier carry. It's sort of similar to Phoebe in that regard, where Phoebe is just not a top tier DPS, so the value of her sequences is a lot less. But as you can probably guess, Thundah is a lot better than Phoebe, so yeah, her sequences are gonna be a lot more valuable than hers. It's just that within Whimpering Waste, she's not as strong of a character. Carlotta, Zani, and Galbrenna suffer from this same issue. Furlova obviously doesn't, because, well, it's Furlova. She's kinda the best Whimpering Waste DPS in the game. It would be kinda silly if I said she wasn't as valuable in Whimpering Wastes. But let's move on to the non-DPS characters in this tier, because there are two here. Those two are Brant and Yuno. Now, okay, funny how the two sub-DPSs that I'm listing are also the ones that function as main DPSs, but that's beside the point. Starting with Brant, his primary value comes from having very high damage output. What do Brant sequences do? Boost it out the ass! Brant's value comes from simply how much damage he is able to do in his teams. That's why he's a better generalist skill damage buffer than Zhezha. Where Zhezha has some utility with 15 energy to the DPS, Brant makes up for his lack of that by simply doing a lot of numbers. So increasing those numbers is going to be very good, especially with the amount of teams that you can shove a Brant into. He's got his main DPS teams, he's got Chang'Li teams, he's got Galbrenna teams, he's got Encore teams, basically every single fusion DPS in the game, and that's not even to mention all the skill damage DPSs that he's gonna work with. So Brant is a very valuable character, and investing into him is not a bad idea at all. But who I'm more confident in is Yuno's S2, because not only is her main DPS team a lot more solid than Brant's, her S2 also has some supportive value for Augusta. And if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Augusta yet, just wait. But back to Yuno. Yuno can be a main DPS, and her S1 and S2 are both very good for making that main DPS playstyle stronger. It's not an incredible main DPS team, but it is still very good. Yuno is also simply a very universal supportive character, working in Phoebe teams, Zani teams, GN teams, her main DPS teams obviously, and Augusta teams, with Augusta being one of the best main DPSs in the game in my opinion. And that's where the S2's supportive value becomes very useful, because an extra 40% damage amplification the second the Blessing of the One Light maxes out is a pretty powerful effect, especially with how backloaded Augusta's damage output is. So being a strong supportive character for one of the best DPS characters in the game, while also having a lot of versatility herself, means that her sequences are automatically going to be high up in the value rankings. Now it is finally going to be time to start talking about the actual cream of the crop, the actual best sequences in the game in my opinion, starting with Augusta's S2. Now I hear what you're asking. Why is Augusta not grouped in with the other main DPS characters, especially Frolova, who has arguably more value than her? Well, it's simple. It all comes down to the damage increase. Cardathea's S0 to S2 is around a 40% damage increase. Same for Galbrenna, same for Frolova, etc, etc. But Augusta takes it a step further. Despite her incredibly solid baseline, Augusta's S2 is still a 48% damage increase over her S0, meaning it is higher than almost all of the other main DPS characters I've talked about up until this point. And obviously this is going to influence her rating, because not only does the baseline of the character have to be good, which is the case with Augusta, the sequences themselves also need to be worth getting. And while I don't think Augusta's S1 is that incredible, it has very good synergy with her S2, because her S1 increases the amount of Crown of Will she can have, and then her S2 and her S6 for that matter scale off of the amount of Crown of Will she has. Her sequences all work in tandem to be incredibly powerful. But not only is Augusta very powerful at a baseline, and she also has a very powerful S2, she also has the additional benefit that Frolova has of being one of the strongest characters when we're looking at both Tower and Whimpering Wastes combined. So Augusta is an incredibly valuable DPS, and getting her sequences is a lot safer than getting the sequences for say a Zani or a Cardathea, because she has proven herself to be strong in both scenarios. Frolova obviously also has this benefit, but her sequences 1 and 2 aren't as powerful as Augusta's, which is why I'm not ranking her on the same tier. And now let's finally talk about the final sequence in this video. And let's be real here, we already know what it is, it's Shorekeeper's S2 again. Is anyone really surprised at this fact? No, no one is surprised. But I do have a disclaimer. I do think that Shorekeeper's S2 is now less valuable than it was the first time I made this video. Since that video, DPS sequences have simply gotten stronger, which is evidenced by the fact that Augusta's S2 is in the same tier as Shorekeeper's, which would normally be unheard of, but here we are. DPS sequences have just been getting stronger and stronger, and they have been devaluing the need of Shorekeeper's S2. but I still think her sequence 2 is the strongest in the game because of just how long it's going to last you. If you get an S2 Augusta, there's a chance that one day you're going to get bored of her and start playing a different DPS. Shorekeeper does not have this weakness. Your personal preference is irrelevant. You are playing Shorekeeper if need be. It's been over a year since Shorekeeper's release, and we still don't have a character that is as universal as her. So honestly, even if they release one in 3.0, I still think S2 Shorekeeper is a pretty safe investment because, well, it's gonna take at least another year for Shorekeeper to not be relevant anymore. The DPS and sub-DPS meta goes by a lot faster than the support meta. So getting an S2 Shorekeeper is not only an upgrade for almost your entire account, it's also an upgrade that's going to serve you dutifully for at least another year, and that is a low ball. It also allows you to simply play worse teams and still clear, because Shorekeeper is almost always going to be a factor in those teams. Shorekeeper's S2 is strong enough to turn Filova Donjon Shorekeeper onto a similar level as Filova Cantarella Rochia. So if you just don't want to invest into a character like Rochia or Cantarella, you can just get S2 Shorekeeper and start brute forcing more mediocre supports. There's simply too many reasons for this sequence to be good. Has the S2 Shorekeeper lost some value? Yes, but that doesn't mean it's no longer the best sequence in the entire game. But those are just my thoughts on the best sequences in Wuthering Waves. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, if you have any questions, you should join my Discord server, which is linked in the description. Additionally, if you just want to see more of me, you can check out my second channel, also linked in the description. But that'll be all from me. Peace.